Welcome to episode 187 of the Woman of the Military podcast. This week my guest is Colleen Forsyth. Colleen served in the Navy as a medical professional. She was looking for a way to pay for college and a path forward, and the Navy gave her that opportunity. She had a hard time picking the right job, but was able to secure a spot in the coveted Corpsman career field. She headed off to boot camp when a spot became open last minute, and she didn't really feel prepared, but was able to get through the training. Today, she is working to build her own business, helping veterans. She created Less BS for Vets and wants to help make the transition process out of the military easier. She also shared her story in a compilation memoir, Into the Mirror. It's another great interview, so let's get started. Welcome to the show, Colleen. I'm excited to have you here.
I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having me, Amanda.
So let's start with, why did you decide to join the military?
So when I decided to join the military, I was 21 and I was living in Colorado. The idea of joining the Navy first came to me a few weeks before Thanksgiving. I was sitting in my room that I rented at my friend's house and trying to figure out what to do with my life when I saw a commercial for the Navy Reserve, and they were advertising a $20,000 bonus. This was at the height of the recession. Things were starting to really get bad. That was when the newspapers this was at the end of 2008. So newspapers had headlines every day about thousands of jobs lost. And I was trying to figure out what to do with my life. So I thought, money for college and $20,000 in the bank, that doesn't sound like a bad way to go. And then I met with the recruiter, and the conversation progressed into her asking me if I wanted to go on active duty, and she mentioned traveling. So it definitely reeled me in.
So you were seeing like $20,000 bonus and a way to pay for college, and that's what got you in the door. And then the recruiter threw out some travel words and other things. You're like, I want to do that.
I did. And she mentioned to me that I could go to Europe and get stationed there. And that was like my dream ticket. And she talked about Spain and Italy. And it's kind of funny because when I joined to go to Europe, but I went to Asia, Africa, and Australia instead. So I went everywhere else but Europe. And to this day, my nephew, my sister was pregnant when she went to Europe. So my nephew has been there and I haven't.
That's kind of funny. Well, at least you did get to travel. Maybe not to Europe.
Yes, I did.
So once you decided that you were going to join, did you pick your career field and then get ready to go to boot camp, or what happened?
So there was actually a long window between when I initially signed up and when I went to boot camp. And I changed jobs probably 4 or 5 times in that time. So it started off, I took the ASVAB and I did really well in certain areas. The one area I did terrible in was mechanical. So then they tried to put me in an engineering role, which clearly was not a good fit. And then they were like, well, maybe you could, work in the air department. Well, I failed my depth perception test. And we tried a couple other things. I had signed my initial contract, but we couldn't send me off because I didn't have a set job yet. And it was around Christmas time, or after the holidays, I went home to Virginia. I had enlisted out of Colorado, and I thought, well, until we get this figured out, I might as well visit family. And my recruiter gave me a call, and we had talked about being a corpsman. But she said probably it wouldn't happen because there were never any billets available for hospital corpsmen. And one magically, somehow it came open, and she told me, she's like, you got to get back here now so you can sign your papers and you can get this slot for boot camp. And I remember I was so excited, and I was like, I got to get to the airport now. My family's like, where are you going? I'm like, I'll tell you when I'm back.
And so did you make it to the recruiting station in time and get all the paperwork?
I did. My recruiter, she didn't necessarily pull some strings, but she didn't advertise that this spot was open. So she told me to hightail it because she could only keep it on the down low for so long. And I literally got a flight she called me at like 6:00 Eastern Standard Time that night. And I was on an early flight the next morning from Washington, D.C. back to Colorado to get this new contract signed so I could lock it in.
Awesome. So how long was it after you signed the contract that you went off to training?
Probably about 3 weeks. And it wasn't supposed to be that quick. So the way it worked was I was going to sign the contract. I had to go back to Denver for that because that's where I enlisted out of. I was living there at the time. And I was going to go back to DC and stay for a few months. And they were projecting maybe May. So I was like, all right, stay with family. That's fine. Well, then I got a call again last minute, and a spot had opened up immediately, and I had to take that spot. So they're like, pretty much you have to drop everything and come back. And I was like, okay. So I think I had a 2-day window to say goodbye to everybody and hop on the plane and go to boot camp in the middle of February 2009.
And it's in Chicago, right? Area?
It's in the Chicago area, so Great Lakes is probably, and I could be wrong about this, I think it's like an hour train ride, give or take. So it's definitely, and I mean, the winters are biting cold is not an accurate description for how powerful those winds are.
I think that was what I was trying to say. It was in the Chicago area. I knew it was cold in February.
I got there at the tail end of winter, and it was still pretty bad. And what they don't tell you is, so they made us run everywhere on base. And even when there's ice on the ground, they expected us to run everywhere in our boots. The only time we were permitted to not run was if they had a base-wide, basically, moratorium on it. And they said that they would do that for safety, but I mean, there'd have to be almost like an inch thick of ice for them to do that.
Yeah, that sounds crazy. So did you feel ready for boot camp since you you were like, oh, I have a few months / days, and then you were on a plane going to boot camp and kind of, I feel like it was really rushed. So did you feel ready?
I was not ready at all. I had no idea what I was getting into. And I remember when I got to the airport, they got us off the plane. There were a group of us that flew together, and the recruit division commanders, RDCs, they were lining us up and telling us to sit in rows. And then, the screaming started immediately once they checked. They're like, are you going to boot camp? We're like, yes. And then they're like, all right, get in line, And so that was an experience. I was not ready. And I really was hard to not start crying, sitting there staring at the back of the head in front of me. But I was like, I gotta keep it together.
And so how did the training progress? Did it get easier as you went through it, or was it a challenge the whole way through?
It was a challenge in the sense that I was 21 and I didn't really know what I was doing, and I knew I needed to do something with my life. Boot camp, it seemed like a good idea, but I had never had that many people screaming at me all the time all at once. And like everything and then ironing was a challenge. Like I was not good at ironing things. And in boot camp, they have a lot of Navy uniforms, so they want you to look on point because Navy is really big into ceremonies. So from day one, they told us, you will get up in the middle of the night and you will iron everything. And they told us, like, even our underwear had to be ironed perfect. So we're learning to march, we're talking about learning important things like firefighting, because if you're on a ship and there's a fire, the whole crew has to firefight. But instead I'm stressed out over, okay, can I get this perfect crease that they want, in my underwear? Like that's what I was stressing out about the first couple weeks. So I guess it made focusing on everything else easier because I was, the little things were the hardest for me.
Yeah, I'm not very good at ironing. I'm like, it seems like it should be easy, but it's kind of hard, especially when you're trying to get those perfect military creases.
The ironing was hard, and getting the perfect creases. In fact, in boot camp, what people used to do, because the way it would work is they would lift in berthing, they basically look like bunk beds. They call them racks because that's what they call them on a ship. So in boot camp, they want to get you prepared for going to the fleet. So they use all the terminology. And everything is designed to fit exactly in its place in a ship bunk. So what they would do is they would go around, and if things weren't folded completely correctly, our RDCs would start pulling everything out and throwing it on the floor. So it wasn't uncommon, like the first 2 weeks at the end of each day, everyone's stuff was thrown everywhere, and like you had to look at each item of clothing and see whose name was written on it so people could give it back. It was stressful.
Yeah, it sounds stressful. So you went through training and you survived it, and then did you graduate boot camp and then head off to your technical school, or did you go to your first base?
So I went from boot camp and I went to technical school. They call it A school. And A school was the general training. So I went to 3 months to learn to be a hospital corpsman. I was one of the last graduating corpsman classes from the training school in Great Lakes, Illinois. Probably about 10 years ago, they combined with the Air Force and the Army in Texas. So the way it works now is everyone gets a similar initial medical training because they wanted to make it so a lot of bases are combining, like Naval Hospital Bethesda is also joined with the Army. It's a joint base. So it's easier to have corpsmen and medics working side by side if they get the same initial training. So there's more familiarity. And we didn't have that. So it would have been nice to see what it was like to learn alongside the Air Force and the Army.
So you went to a training and you were one of the last classes. Now they do it so this joint, that makes sense to do it in a way where you get to work beside your other branches, learn the terminology, all be on the same page. So after that, did you go into the fleet?
I did not. So the way it worked was I honestly had no idea what I wanted to do. I was just going to class. My only concern was to not fail a test. We had a test each week and I wanted to pass all the tests so then that way I could get orders. And I figured I'd go to a clinic or something. They told us from day one, have realistic expectations. You're probably going to go to a hospital or a clinic and just take vital signs. So I said, okay, a lot of people dream of like seeing action or going with the Marines because corpsmen, they go with the Marines. And it's a lot of times people want to go to battle and see all this crazy stuff. So I don't know if disappointed is the word, but they needed their expectations checked a little bit. But near the end of our graduation, we got the option to pick a C school. So that's like an advanced technical school. And one thing I knew I wanted to do is eventually go back to college. So they mentioned a lab tech program. So they mentioned an associate's degree from George Washington University out of Washington, D.C., which is a fantastic school. And it's expensive to get any kind of degree from there. So I was like, okay, solid training I can get and it'll be useful after the military. So I signed up for it. Plus, they said that we would be in San Diego for a year. So going to California was not a problem in my book.
Okay, so you signed up for that program. Was it competitive to get into that program, or did everyone who wanted to do it get to do it?
So pretty much everyone who wanted to do it got to do it because I wouldn't say not a lot of people didn't want to go to lab school, but it wasn't as popular. Like everyone was always trying to get into the X-ray tech program, and that one was always full. So I think my choices were like surgical tech, pharmacy tech, and lab tech, and preventative medicine. They always needed people in those areas.
So you went to tech school and then you went to this lab tech school and you got your associates. How long? You said it was a year?
It's actually really interesting because I did go to San Diego to start lab tech school, but I did not finish it. And it was pretty mortifying at the same time. I probably made it barely halfway through the program. And I struggled. So the way it works is lab school is split into 4 3-month sections. There's the first section, 3 months is testing. Then the second window is 3 months of clinicals. And then the second half is split again. The first half is the advanced schooling, like on hematology and other things. And then you have 3 months of clinicals before you get pushed out into the fleet. So I reached the maximum number of test failures in the first 3-month window. I made it through clinicals, but they told me if I failed one more exam, I was going to get kicked out. I did study. Unfortunately, hematology beat me, and I did not pass that class. And so I was thrown into holding company. And holding company was basically, we went there and they gave us stuff to do like sweep or paint or shred, whatever little things they needed done. But failing out of lab school is one of the best things that's ever happened to me because I got temporary orders to a ship down at 32nd Street. And that is the ship eventually I got orders to.
Yeah, and I guess it was a good thing to get sent there. So let's talk a little bit more about that and why it was such a good experience.
So when I first got to the ship, I was very young. I didn't know what I wanted to do. And, it was fine. I was an E3, which is one of the very junior ranks. And when I got to the ship, immediately I was thrown into the middle of things. So I was on a destroyer. And even though I was temporary, there were only 3 corpsmen. And the corpsmen were at the center of everything. So I was expected to interact with the crew and I was expected to answer tough questions. It's very challenging as an E3 to be expected to diplomatically tell someone of a higher rank, no, you have to go to your medical appointment or you cannot be late for your shots. And I started to get into the rhythm of things quickly. I ended up getting there and I found out they were deploying and they needed a female corpsman immediately because the one they had was having to transfer off the boat. For medical reasons, I'm not 100% sure what. But the first day I got there, my senior chief walked in and, he asked me some questions about what I was doing and my career path. And I told him, I'm like, I'm up for orders and I'd love to deploy. And so he's like, okay, well, I'm calling the detailer right now. And he called the detailer and he got the orders locked in. And the schoolhouse was so mad because the way it works as a corpsman, it's really hard to get orders to a ship. There just aren't a lot of billets. So I was getting to go to a ship and there were E5s and E6s that had deployed with the Marines and been in 10, 15, 20 years. And they had never been to a ship. And here I am, this little E3 that's been in the Navy barely a year. I fail out of lab school and I'm getting like golden ticket of orders.
That's how it goes, right? Right place, right
that's what
time.
it was. It was timing and they needed somebody immediately. And it was hard to get another corpsman from the hospital because the hospital, they need their people too. And the fact that I was up for orders, like I was just in the right window.
I mean, that's just the way it goes sometimes with a lot of stuff that happens in the military. Different things in your career or different opportunities. It's just knowing the right person, being in the right place. So you got the orders, and even though some people were mad, did they stick?
They did stick, but they didn't like it. And I won't say that they tried to screw it up, but they didn't make it easy. And this was about June 2010, and it was a stressful month because I was trying not to get my hopes up. I was so excited at the idea of going to a ship and seeing the real Navy, but I just wanted to let life happen. Well, my senior chief at the time was determined that this was going to happen because he had things to do and he had something he had to get done before he left because we didn't deploy until September, but we were slated to potentially leave on deployment in July. So there wasn't enough time to waffle. He needed a person then. So it happened.
So between June and September when you guys finally left, like, were you doing training to get prepared for the deployment, or what was a typical day like? And then what was it like when you actually were out at sea?
So the in-between time was chaotic because I was going to the ship and then going back to the schoolhouse and trying to get everything done to be able to go to the ship if it got cleared. So I had medical exams, and at the time I'd had anemia, so I had to do a lot of extra tests to make sure I was cleared to go to the ship. And then I had to move from my barracks to the ship and get everything else lined up and figure out a place to put my car. And it was a whirlwind. So it was, but definitely exciting. And I got the orders locked in. And then I think I had less than a week to get moved out and get to the ship and report. And I remember my first day there, I had a bunch of files shoved in my hands. And I was told, don't screw these up because if you do, you'll kill someone. And I was like, oh, that's no pressure. So there was no transition time. I didn't get to like process or, have a really nice intro where I got a tour of the ship and got to take it slow. No, it was like from that day, I hit the ground running.
Yeah, and it shows the responsibility required for military members. Like, you're almost brand new and they're like, this is important. Like, if you don't do this, there are consequences and someone could die. And it's like, oh, wow, this is the military. It's not just like, oh, someone might get a paper cut. It's like a big deal. And even when you're a young enlisted rank, that doesn't change the fact that you play an important role in meeting the mission.
Exactly. And like the mission hit me head on from literally the time I got there. And it was a lot because I knew my job was important. And I knew that I had to set an example for the crew, but it didn't hit me until I was there exactly what that meant, because they always tell you in Corps school, don't expect to do everything right away. You're going to have to put your time in and get a higher rank. And it just was a lot faster. And, I remember right before I got there and my orders were set in, there was a captain's call out on the flight deck with everyone, and the CO is there, and we're all out there, and I'm just standing, I'm standing in the back and just listening. And then the CO gives me a shout out, and he's like, we'd like to welcome our new baby doc. And everyone turns and looks at me, and I'm like, and I just remember awkwardly waving, hi. So it was a small command, but it was a lot all at once, and leadership was already looking to me for answers to questions if that was the need of the day.
Lots of responsibility. So where did you end up going on your deployment? You said that you went not to Europe. I know that.
So I went to Asia, Africa, and Australia instead. So my ship was interesting. We had 2 deployments within a very short window. So the ship was out for 6 months, and then we were back for 8, and then out for another 6. But during that 8-month window, we went into something called dry dock, where the ship did all their repairs quickly. So typically at the time, ships cycle, they'd have 1 or 2 deployments in a maybe 3-year window, and then somewhere in between have a year in dry dock. We jammed it all into less than 24 months. So the first deployment, we went to, the very first port we pulled into was in the Philippines. We were supposed to go to Manila, but we ended up going to Subic Bay, which is where the Navy used to have a base, but the port's still open, so ships can pull in. And I was so excited. It was the first foreign country I'd ever been to, and it was about a month into deployment, and everyone was just ready to go and have a good time.
And then did you get to go and explore the Philippines? I know that when you're on a ship, you have to like go in groups. So were you able to do that?
In Subic Bay, we had a pretty tight radius. There were a few blocks we were authorized to go to, but it was the first stop of the deployment. They wanted to make sure that, everything was kept safe and centered, and we put on a good, kept everything organized. So overnight liberty was not allowed. Some ports you could go out and stay overnight, some you couldn't. For this port call, we had to be in groups of 2 or 3. So at the time, a male and female couldn't go out overnight alone. I think they could go out for day liberty alone. Now, obviously, the rules differ for each ship, and it's really up to the captain. So for this port, we could go out in groups. The only thing we couldn't do is you can't go out alone. So you had to have a liberty buddy.
So was there anything from either of those deployments that really like stood out or changed you as a person?
That port was actually the port where I fell in love with my future husband. And, it was definitely an interesting experience, and I made a lot of lifelong friends, and we had a great time. I remember this amazing beach bar. We all just danced, and the drinks were fantastic, and it was really just like a college dive bar on the beach, but it was interesting because it was in a different country.
Yeah, that sounds really fun. And were you like really busy when you were on the ship? Like, did you have to work a lot of hours, or did you have to do watches, or what was that experience like being out at sea?
So in port, corpsmen would stand watch, and this was always kind of a sensitive topic because corpsmen do not stand watch underway, and that was not popular necessarily with the rest of the crew. But the reason is we were always on call if there was a man down. So basically we were kind of on call 24/7. I remember one night we had an electrical shock patient, someone with chest pain, and then someone fell at the same time. So all 3 of us were sent in different directions on the ship. But that's why we didn't stand watch underway. But we did work. Working hours on the ship were officially from 0600 to 2200. Now, obviously, you don't work every single second. Sometimes you can work out during lunch and get like a 2-hour lunch. And usually after dinner, it would wind down. So chow was at 1800. So we'd probably stop working around 2000, so 8 p.m., and get a couple hours. We never got a full day off. Sunday was holiday routine. So we might be allowed to sleep until like 9 if we didn't have a patient. We could take a slightly longer lunch and work out, watch a movie in the afternoon. But generally, the expectation was that after lunch, we'd work between lunch and dinner at least.
Yep, always working. I remember that about my deployment too. It's like, you're always working. Yeah. So that was like 2 deployments in like less than 2 years. And then did you get off that ship and go to another ship, or did you get out of the military? What happened next?
I did 2 deployments, and before the second one, I actually found out that my detailer had not written my orders correctly. So corpsmen were supposed to go to ships for 3 years, but I had 2-year orders. So that opened up a lot of doors for what I could do. So I ended up deciding I was having trouble negotiating with the Navy for where they wanted me to go next. I had done 2 deployments. I wasn't too fixated on a specific duty location, but I had an idea of what I wanted. And they basically told me, well, you only get to go needs in the Navy. And I'm like, well, it wasn't really going to work for me. I had done a lot and I'd seen a lot, and that was great, but I wanted a little bit of a say in what I got to do next. And that just wasn't happening. So I remember I was talking to another senior chief that came to the ship, and there was a medical inspection team. And he was asking about my career, what I wanted to do. And I mentioned my frustrations in dealing with the detailer. And he's like, well, you're an E4. You'll go where the Navy tells you to go, not where you want. And that just didn't really strike a good chord with me. I wasn't feeling it. And so I said, okay, well, if that's the attitude the Navy wants to take, then I know what I want to do. The reason it was so important that my orders were written the way they were was I had another option, which was, so the military constantly has something called the early out option. And at the time, the Navy was trying to reduce their force. So this was an option I've been aware of, and you can get out of your contract up to 24 months early. So I used this window to drop my early out package and basically request to get out of 19 months of my contract. And it worked out really well because the ship wanted to say no, but they couldn't because I asked to get out the same month they were slated to get a replacement for me.
That worked out nicely. So you were able to use the early out option and take the time from your time in the Navy and start something new.
I did start something new. My initial plan had been to go to college, but it was a little bit of a crazy time because, again, I didn't get a nice, gentle transition from military life to civilian life. Instead, I looked for a job, and I did find a great one, but I only had a couple months before I ended up having to move to Hawaii. But this time it was with my then husband because he was getting transferred there. So I went with him as a military spouse.
That's one of the challenges of being a military spouse, having a career and then having to move and find another career or start over in a new career. So in Hawaii, were you able to find a career, or did you go to school? What did you do?
In Hawaii, I did find a really good job. I ended up working in an architecture firm, and it was interesting. We were not going to be there that long because at the time we were trying to figure out, the whole, well, are we re-enlisting? Are we getting out? Are we done with the military? And it seemed to be, the decision was finally that leaving the military behind was the best decision. So I waited to go to school because I wanted to figure out where we were going to live. And we finally decided that, yes, going to school was the right plan. And we were definitely done with military life.
So it was very interesting going through transitioning out of the military to life after. I moved from Hawaii to Illinois a few months prior to my then husband because the idea was I was going to look for a job so we could have some stability once he was out and rejoin me. So once I had an idea, we decided I was going to move that September, and this was in 2012. So I started school a month before because it seemed like a good time to get it going because college was going to take a few years and it was something I really wanted to knock out. So I started originally with an accounting degree and I was a full-time student. And at the same time, I was getting ready to coordinate yet another cross-country move. And I was going to take my animals with me. Like we had pets. I think at the time we had a dog and 3 chinchillas. So lots of moving parts. And I landed in Illinois and I didn't know what I was going to do. I was looking for a job. The GI Bill has an option, basically it has a built-in internship with it. So it's almost like a work study. So it's not a lot of money. I think it's minimum wage, but it was enough. It was at least something. And at the time I was staying with my in-laws. So it was a little bit of money coming in to help buy groceries, gas, stuff like that. And during my internship, I actually was interning at the VA and I got to know some of the people there. And I hadn't even considered working for the federal government. But after a few months, they're like, have you thought about working here? And I said, well, I don't really want to apply through USA Jobs. It takes months and I need something sooner. So then I found out about a hiring program called VRA. I think it's Veterans Recruitment Authority. And for recently separated veterans, they can basically bypass the hiring process and get hired directly into certain positions. And this was really appealing to me because I wanted a good job, and I knew working for the federal government was great. As a civilian, it was kind of overwhelming to try to figure out the whole process. So it was just timing and luck that I found out about this, because I had no idea the VRA even existed.
Sounds like you're often in the right place at the right time.
I think part of it is I've never been shy about talking to people. And this is both a pro and a con, but when people ask me how I'm doing, I genuinely answer. So I'm not even looking for anything or seeking anything from anyone. I'm just direct. And if people are like, how are you? I'm like, I probably answered, I'm just really stressed out trying to figure out this job and move transition. I'm like, I didn't